Welcome to the On-Premise IT Podcast, the only show that dares to be both on topic or on-premise, and sometimes on location, on premises. Each time we meet, we bring together a group of IT experts to discuss a single idea. Today's episode is focused on the little guys, the little animals out there blazing a trail while the dinosaurs fight, the small startups. Before we get started, let's meet who's on the panel today.
Hi everyone, my name is Rose Ross and I'm the founder and chief trailblazer at the Tech Trailblazers Awards.
Hi, I'm Justin Warren, founder and principal analyst at Pivot9 Analysts and Consultants.
And hi, I'm Tim Crawford. I'm CIO and strategic advisor at Avoa.
And as usual, I'm Stephen Foskett, organizer of the Tech Field Day events and publisher of Gestalt IT. So those of us in the industry who watch the industry as sort of independent analysts and so on, I think that it's kind of an evocative image to think about the little mammals running around in the underbrush while the dinosaurs are fighting. And that to me is sort of symbolic of what happens in the IT industry too. Certainly we're at a strange time. I don't want to stretch the metaphor too much, but the asteroid hit. The pandemic really messed up the economy. The big dinosaurs are all fighting to see who can survive. There's the cloud out there, and it's threatening them all too. And at the same time, there's all this innovation happening in the startup ecosystem, and that's really what the Tech Trailblazers is about. And it's why I enjoy being part of it. Let's start though with the dinosaurs. Justin, do you want to go first? Tell us a little bit more about this battle of the old companies.
Yeah, it's one of those things that comes up from time to time for those of us who've been in the industry a while, where people get used to the way things were being done. They get very large under the conditions that were conducive to them growing, and then something changes. And we often find that the big incumbents don't really understand what's going on. Basically, they just don't see it. And when it happens, they all panic. And that panic can kind of spread through the industry a bit. People fire lots of people and start worrying about the future of the industry, and it's all doom and gloom. And then while that's going on, we have all the startups who just get on with it, and for them, it's much more of an opportunity. So it's a period of change, and we're kind of right in the middle of it, which is always really tricky to see what it's going to look like next. While you're right there looking at, this is all happening around us, it's hard to see what the future will actually be, but it's fun to speculate.
It's interesting to see how these incumbents play through this time period. And when you think about it, there's also a lot of inertia that's at play too, that you can't deny. And so, especially in the enterprise and large enterprise space, change is hard. And so bringing innovation in can be hard and sometimes can be risky. However, one of the things we are very quickly realizing, and we've kind of gotten a masterclass in it through the pandemic, is that we have to change. Our stakeholders are changing. Our expectations on our business is changing. Our customers are changing. Even the same customers that we've been serving for the last decade or so, they're changing. And so our business must change, and therefore the technology that we use to help innovate our business must also change. The challenge is it's hard for these incumbents to make those tectonic shifts, unlike some of the startups that can be incredibly innovative and bring both new technology, new process, and just a new way of thinking without all of the historical baggage that sometimes comes to bear with some of these incumbents. And so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, but we are definitely at a pivot point within the industry.
And we've definitely always seen that you only get a startup if somebody sees that there's something missing in one of the big areas, one of the big players. You wouldn't risk, your livelihood. You wouldn't give up a job. You wouldn't ask for funding. You wouldn't remortgage your home unless you thought you had something to bring to the party. So, I think that's why trailblazing is the way it is, because people see that there's a path that needs to be trodden and they don't see anybody else doing it or doing it as well as they should do.
And there's a risk for these big companies too, because it's incredibly rare for a company to undermine their own business, their own market, their own products by innovating. It so rarely happens. My favorite recent example is Apple coming out with the iPhone, competing with the iPod, which was their golden egg, and putting that functionality in something that people weren't going to buy anymore. And basically, nope, we're giving up on this entire product that we're defined by, and we're going to go in this other direction. And we're so confident that, and it worked. And you rarely see companies do that, especially big companies, big public companies, because they just can't afford it. In the trailblazing metaphor, I guess, you're stuck on the highway. It's not like you can drive the semi down the trail. You have to let the trail mature a bit before you can go there. And also, you really have to, kind of make sure that you're making the most of the products and the market that you already have, because you run the risk of really, completely collapsing instead of, going in a different direction.
Yeah, and to take that a step further, I mean, the math doesn't play out anymore for these folks. In the past, each of these large incumbents would have massive R&D budgets. In fact, their success would be measured in some ways based on how much money they were spending in R&D. And you don't see that to the same degree anymore. Most of the innovation comes from outside. And so if you kind of think about the math of it, if we're making 10 different bets within one of these companies, and let's say each one is 10 units, well, that's 100 units worth of cost to take these 10 bets, and maybe only one of them plays out. So now you're spending 100 units for 10 units of one particular outcome, as opposed to letting the marketplace, the broader marketplace, and startups do the innovation, take the risk, and then I can go out, and even if I'm paying twice as much for a company, that's 20 units versus 100 units, and it's a surer thing. So the risk level is low, the cost is low from the vendor standpoint. But I think that the challenge from the customer is, how do you know which ones to start working with, and which ones, on both the incumbent side of things as well as the startups, which ones are actually going to align best with where you need to take your business? And that's a bit tricky, because we don't necessarily think that way, or haven't had to think that way over the last several decades. But that's exactly what we need to do moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the challenges for the startups as well. Some of them may have the absolutely blindingly diamond idea, but can they actually express it to you, Tim, as a CIO? They might be completely off beam with the messaging. So you need some pointers to go, hey, sometimes I need to understand better what you're trying to to give me, and see if that actually fits with what I need, or what I might need in 12 months' time.
And maybe one additional point to that, and I'll turn it over to Justin, which is the CIO really your penultimate target or customer, or should they be? In the past, that was always the case, was if you can get to the CIO, oh my gosh, you're golden. That's the way to go. That is not the case anymore. And there are a lot of reasons for that, which we probably won't go into in this particular episode. But you have to understand who it is you're targeting, why you're targeting them, and who at the right level you should be targeting. And that will then inform you as to, as you said, Rose, how you communicate and pitch your particular solution for success.
We see that with our consulting clients all the time. This is basically what we spend most of our day doing, is talking to these companies. But you make a good point, both of you, about how do you find out what people want and what is that need. I think as these incumbents have struggled with that because they've been looking inside, not outside. So they kind of don't know what they want either. And that makes it difficult for some of the startups, because you're talking to people in these big companies and trying to get them to tell you what they actually want. They say what they think they want, and that's not often the same thing. And so there's that real risk that for startups in particular is that you might be developing off in a direction which isn't actually what customers want. It's what they've told you, but it's like you have to look behind that a bit and really figure out what's going on. But that's where you need to be much more in touch with what customers are actually doing, and do your homework. Go and look into, well, what is actually really going on, rather than it just being this vague reaction to, well, we think everyone else is doing this, so we'll just kind of follow the herd. The real trailblazers there, they have a really solid understanding of what customers are really doing, what the real need is, and how to solve it.
Well, the model's broken. right? I mean, if you look back over time, the model used to be vendor asks customer, what do you need? Vendor goes off and builds it. 6 months later, they come back, they deliver it, customer buys it, and then the cycle repeats itself. It's the old Henry Ford quote. If I would have asked customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Obviously, he had a different vision, and I think this is where startups really play an integral role, is not just asking customers what they want, but rather stepping back and identifying where are the opportunities that maybe they haven't asked for yet.
Definitely. And that's certainly what we're seeing with the kind of people you kind of look at what they're offering and you go, how's that going to fit into today? And actually, they're not necessarily developing something for today because they've already seen that there's going to be a gap in 6, 12 months' time, or it's a very small niche market at the moment, but it has so much potential to grow because of the way that the market's moving. And they're the guys who are going to be really making a mark in the future.
Yeah, it's tricky for the tech companies too, because they, like, you can often see, oh, this is a technical thing that we think we should build a better mousetrap, but then how do you actually talk about it to customers? And that's something that, like, the entire tech industry struggles with, the incumbents as well as some of the new people. The really good trailblazers are good at not only building the technology but talking about it in a much more human and accessible way, talking about not just speeds and feeds, but the benefits to you, like, why does this exist? What is it for? What does it do for me? And why is it different from something else I might have otherwise considered? And then, as you mentioned, Tim, trying to get customers to realize that, I'd never thought about it that way. You know what? You're right. I definitely do want that.
One of the problems that I see that does come up sometimes is you see these really kind of innovative solutions looking for a problem. And then they really struggle to have that conversation around, well, this is a great thing, and you could do all of these really cool things with it. Well, you're assuming from the customer standpoint that I have those problems or one of those problems, and that isn't always the case. And so the conversation really needs to start with, what is it what problem are you really trying to solve for from an orientation standpoint? And then how are you looking to solve it? And the trap you have to be careful about is, just because there's a problem there doesn't necessarily mean it's meant to be solved or should be solved. And so there's a value equation that you have to go through to say, okay, we could solve this problem, but is this really where we should be putting our time and effort? And more importantly, do we think that customers will buy it? And if it's not rising, kind of the cream rising to the top, where it's going to be solving one of the big problems that a customer has, it's going to be a pretty long sales cycle and pretty hard to sell, which is, the death knell for startups. You want that quick, easy to see the path toward progress and be able to pull the trigger and go.
So one of the things that I see about the technology industry today, though, is, I mean, we could have had this conversation, much of this conversation, at any point for quite a few years, maybe decades, right? But I think there's a fundamental difference in the technology industry today, and it all revolves around sort of the way that things are constructed. We live in a world now, well, number one, where everything is software. I mean, software has eaten the world for the most part. Very few companies are coming out with a new hardware product. You look at the Tech Trailblazers award category. I don't see the hardware category in here. I'm sorry. I think you might have missed that one. No, it's not hardware. It's things are AI and cloud and containers and developers and IoT and edge, and all this stuff is built on software. But more to the point, not just on software, on basically a proliferation of open source and cloud components. And not just on that, but on a very developer-centric, microservices-centric way of doing things. And so basically the entire nature of technology in the enterprise tech space has changed to the point now where I think it's much easier for these companies to think of an idea, communicate with the people who are actually out there needing things, because they're on GitHub, they're at conferences, they're asking for a tool that does this or that. It's much easier for them to build the thing because they don't have to, put solder wires together, or let alone, design an ASIC or something like that. And it's much easier for them to build that thing based on pre-existing components, because open source is there's so much open source now. There's so many projects. A lot of it is funded by the hyperscalers. I think we live in a different world fundamentally than we used to. And actually, I think that really changes the game too, because so many of the quote dinosaurs that we talk about are really hardware companies at heart who are trying to be software companies, but that's not the world anymore. They live in the previous era, right? Tim, you have such a good connection with the enterprise world and the enterprise CIO. Is this right? Am I on track here?
You absolutely are. I mean, to a large degree, if you look at the private conversation versus the public conversation goes something like, yeah, I partner with different hardware providers. Sure. The private conversation is, I don't care. I keep them close just so I know if they're going to fall off the rails and I can adjust accordingly. But the reality is, if you look at how enterprise CIOs are up leveling the conversation within their organizations, so not just the conversation they're having, but then the way that their team is operating, the hardware itself is very, very quickly becoming a commodity between vendors. And so the problem with that is, when you create too many dots that you have to connect between the value that the hardware brings and a specific business outcome, it's really hard to say one vendor's product over another vendor's product is better or worse. They're all going to do what you need to do. The problem is that these vendors that are in the hardware space are really struggling to break free of that inertia and those chains that have held them back for so long. And so transitioning from being a hardware company to more of a software company, that's not a trivial thing to do. But software, as you said, is something that is more directly tied to those business outcomes, more so than infrastructure and hardware.
Yeah, we're seeing a similar sort of trend in how, I mean, we push this trend as well. Like CIOs, you want to preserve optionality. We know we've just experienced a very pointed reminder of how quickly things can change. So if you're trying to bake in we're going to pick one thing and this is going to be our strategy for 5 years, it's like, who can predict 5 years in the future in this industry? I mean, really, look 5 years ago, is this how you thought things would pan out? So what we're seeing instead is that there's a lot more flexibility required and the ability to play well with others, which has always been true to a point. Enterprises like to buy 7 of everything, but you need to have these components work together. And the startups are much, much better at being compatible with other things because they have to be. A lot of the incumbents try to make, like, we'll have a first among equals. Our stuff will work better with our stuff. But if you want to bring in something from the outside, it's like, well, yeah, maybe it'll work. But that has become a lot easier as with some of the changes in industry that you mentioned, Stephen, like REST APIs. Cisco devices didn't have any real way of connecting with the outside world to interoperate with them and to control them. Whereas now everything has REST APIs. Everyone expects that you will be able to operate infrastructure and software systems from some kind of orchestration layer. And it will be something that you can choose which one you have. You don't have to have one that's built by the vendor. And if you really want to, you can build your own. So in that system now of lots of little modules that are all trying to connect to one another, it's pretty complicated. It can be hard to navigate, but that is the way the industry is moving, is to have lots of these independent components in a much more distributed systems fashion, all kind of working together in a big swarm rather than having a single monolith like a mainframe.
And that's exactly where the startups are really starting to come into their own, because the big guys have had to open things up, and that's it's basically opening up the floodgates to, if you can connect to something, you can create a product that connects to something and maybe adds some value to that scenario.
I wonder, though, is there a problem here in that maybe these companies, maybe the barrier of entry is so low now because of software and APIs and this whole world? is this also sort of a problem for those companies as well, because they just can't have the same kind of expansive vision for lock-in that their predecessors had? I mean, Hewlett and Packard in the garage soldering things together. They saw that they could build basically technology that people couldn't escape from, and that they would be building, decade-long business. Is the same true of a company that's, developing a new ML model?
I think it depends on what layer of the stack you're talking about. When you get into the hardware and the infrastructure, there is a pretty significant barrier to entry for new entrants to be able to be successful, because you have to get to a price performance level that is on par with the existing folks, and they just have, frankly, the scale and the girth to be able to out maneuver you. However, it's much easier to build software. And as we're seeing just in the last couple of years, even though AI has been around for decades, we're starting to see how generative AI is really changing how we think about data. And now, literally, anybody can touch and start to leverage data, and they don't have to be an expert in technology on the back end to be able to do it. And so as we start to make technology more approachable, we start to get, the citizen developer, this, with low code, no code solutions. We start to get the citizen data scientist with generative AI and prompt engineering type solutions, or even embedding this technology within an existing tool. And so then it just becomes kind of plugging the different pieces together. But again, you're starting to see this abstraction layer very quickly getting created, where you have to move away from the infrastructure and focus on the software. Now, the caveat to that I'll say is, at some point you reach a certain amount of scale where in some situations public cloud might be the right solution, in other situations private cloud might be the right solution, and yet in other scenarios you might have your own infrastructure on-prem because the cost model just dictates that, or regulatory compliance, sovereignty issues. I mean, the list goes on, that's going to drive those decisions. That being said, there is a huge opportunity for startups to step in and capitalize on this shifting software space, because the barrier to entry is asymptotically headed towards zero.
Yeah, the opportunity is really around the processes, about what is this for? And a lot of the incumbents have this challenge where they, particularly where they go for efficiency, because efficiency tends to move things towards automation, but that means baking in whatever you're doing right now and trying to squeeze as much, squeeze out all of the friction points. But efficient can make it really, really brittle. It's also quite hard to change, because everything else, if this is a fully automated system, everything else has to talk to that automated system. So changing it is quite tricky. You have to kind of throw the whole thing out and start again. And that's the opportunity for startups, is they can come in with this radically new idea or new way of thinking about, well, what if you change the way you thought about this process? What are you actually trying to achieve? Why are you still doing it this way? That worked 5-10 years ago, but it's like, yeah, but the world's different now. Why are you still doing all of this manual handling? And you've automated this process where you scan a document which you then print out again. Why? This is one of the challenges I have with some of these large language models, where you'll have someone will generate, will do a prompt, and it'll generate an email which will send off to some other people who will then summarize the email and plug it into another system. It's like, why are you doing any of this at all? Why not just stop? Because there's a whole bunch of these things that are just, why are we even doing this at all? Stop it. Change to doing something else. As we did with, why is everyone commuting to the office and back and wasting 3 hours a day when you can just jump on a call like this and talk to people on the other side of the world?
It's exactly that, fresh eyes looking at what you're doing from the outside, not from the inside. And I think that's such a valuable part. And I totally get that you guys have seen that. And it's exciting. It's kind of scary, I'm sure, particularly for the big guys, because they've got a lot of momentum, but they also can go down quite quickly. We're seeing in a very exciting time, and it's going to be challenging for lots of businesses. And so part of that is also challenging for the startups as well. But I think people will have to go. We need to think about things a bit differently if we want to survive this.
Yeah, I mean, there's another piece that often doesn't come up in conversations, and some customers might look at it and go, I really don't care. But it does impact decisions that some of these incumbents make. And to be honest, I mean, one of those is that most of them are publicly traded companies. They have a certain set of investors that have been with them, institutional investors, not retail investors, but institutional investors that are looking for them to spit off certain returns and growth. And they are absolutely not comfortable with a company being disruptive, because that might impact that growth short term, which then, screws them in terms of the returns for a quarter or two, or maybe even 4 quarters or 6 quarters. Whereas a startup can say, you know what, we had plan A. As we started to learn more about our assumptions that went into plan A, we started to realize that we need a plan B, and we can shift gears. And as long as our short list of investors, relatively speaking, are on board with that, we can make that pivot and change and really kind of adapt to what customers ultimately need. You can't do that with these incumbents. I mean, some of them have the potential to do it, but that would require them to take some pretty dramatic steps by, for example, splitting off a piece of the company. We saw IBM do this with Kyndryl, and then we saw how Kyndryl kind of played out so far, which isn't great. But is that the model? I don't think so. But I think some of these have a little bit of potential to do that. But I think the startups, again, are really where that innovation is ultimately going to come from.
One of the things that I want to kind of get to the Trailblazers awards here specifically, Rose, one of the things that I look at is the Firestarter category, because you talk about funding and you talk about VCs and things like that. The idea that that companies can basically now start without all that is just incredible. I mean, what do you see there?
Well, I mean, it's something we introduced a while ago because we felt that there were lots of, we're talking a few years ago now, when there were a lot of funding rounds, people were being able to secure an awful lot of money, but we were seeing people who were already quite mature. They already had a big customer base, or a relatively big customer base, had a lot of support, a lot of recognition, a lot of awareness for what they were doing. And the Firestarters was very much more about people who hadn't got VC funding yet and were quite young. And it only really is relevant, really, to what we were talking about, the fact that if you're hardware, that's not going to work, because you kind of need to have that money. You need to have a Series A to be able to get everything in place to be able to do it. However, now with the software only businesses, you don't need that. You need the idea, and then you need the development team to make it happen, and then you can go and get from A to B without any funding, but do it at seed or angel level. And that's what the Firestarters is about. So it's the younger players, the really, really new kids on the block. So and we're seeing more and more of them as well, and it's exciting, because that some of these are still, they may well pivot one or more times before they actually get to where they need to get to kind of be mature, but they can, because they are working with a much more flexible approach to the whole situation.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing, and I'd love to see more of it. The challenge is making sure that you're not just a bit player. You're not just creating a feature, calling your product a product, but yet it's really just a feature in the big scheme of things. But on the other extreme, you can't build platforms either. There's a lot of risk to it. There's not a big appetite from the investment community to build platforms. It's really hard to exit and integrate platforms into existing platforms. So how do you become a product that is actually solving a core issue for customers, but it's more than a feature and less than a platform? And that's really kind of the navigating that most of these companies have to carefully thread the needle on.
Yep, they do. And they should come and talk to us because that's what we help people do. Yeah, it is quite tricky. Yeah, to be able to figure out how you find that sweet spot.
I do wonder whether, and I know we're kind of going to be wrapping up soon, but whether in a few years' time, if we were having this conversation again, we'll have seen a rise in maybe the collaborative startup approach, where people who have got things that mold together to become a bigger product start to work together and then maybe ultimately become a company. The whole joint venture stuff always has been traditionally something primarily for big companies, but maybe smart VCs will one day, let's find a stable of people who make something bigger than the two parts or three parts of what they are. So maybe that's the future.
Well, and I think that's a really great point, Rose. And, to be a little provocative, I would say just as the incumbent space has to evolve and kind of really needs a redo, so does the VC space. I mean, the VC space, to a large degree, is broken as well because it serves investors, it serves a number of different stakeholders, but does it ultimately serve the customer first? And the answer is no, it doesn't. And so I think that's a miss, and I think we've seen some pretty hard challenges. But the other thing is, if you look at the returns coming out of it, yeah, okay, so it's been profitable for some of those folks, but look at all the energy that's gone into these companies that fail. What if we could redirect and have a higher success output rate and redirects that energy into solving some of these bigger issues? Again, not suggesting we go all the way to platforms, but get out of focusing on features and focus on something more valuable to companies. I think that would actually be far more interesting. But it's going to require a rethink as to how we do investment and how we manage and direct these companies too.
Well, I guess that's the opportunity of these periods of change is that we can rethink how we did things. So that's what historically this is what's happened. If we've had some incumbents that failed to change quick enough and they tend to die off, and then some of the new people who've had a rethink about it built those new products as you mentioned, Tim. This is the time where that all happens. So we're right in the middle of it. It's kind of fun.
Definitely agree with that. I mean, I think one of the big things is I've always thought with startups is your most important investors are your customers. And I think that maybe if they can really embrace that, yes, of course, getting external funding is important. But if you can get a loyal customer base, if you can get ambassadors in the marketplace for you and that revenue stream, maybe we will see less reliance perhaps on the VC funding moving forward.
So, as Rose was saying, I think there's a lot of inertia around the incumbents, but they're going to have to change. They're going to have to rethink how they're approaching these problems. But I think this also opens the door for startups to really kind of navigate and set the pace and direction that companies go. And frankly, if they're successful, they actually will be at the pointy end of the arrow and bring the incumbents along. Those that ultimately don't survive or don't make that transition, that successful transition, I think will eventually die. I mean, again, because there's so much inertia around them, even if they screw up, any of them, it's going to be a long time before we see them disappear. But this really is a pivotal time for these startups to really kind of shine, and I'd love to see them succeed in doing that.
Yeah, I do love to see it when these companies come out with something new, something interesting, and especially as Justin points out, something profitable. I love to see it when when they can build themselves by answering something that the customers need, and like where Rose was saying too about that the customer is the best investment. I love that's an incredible thought, and I would love to see that be something that more companies embrace. I guess when I'm looking at these awards, when I'm kind of judging these things, I'm looking for companies that have real products that aren't just features, that aren't just somebody else's R&D. It kind of sickens my stomach a little bit when I see a company that has absolutely no business model and is just trying to, get bought. And then on the flip side, I see some of these companies that are obviously building something useful, something interesting, and something that's a real product, and that's what I'm looking for. I guess before we go, Rose, tell us a little bit more about the awards. What's the calendar for it, and what should we expect this year?
So, firstly, I'm delighted to meet Tim and Justin, and thanks for facilitating that, Stephen. It's been a really exciting conversation, and I think we share a lot of similar views, despite the fact of the distance between us. We are situated literally across the globe for this conversation, and that very much mirrors the approach we've taken to the awards to look at what's actually happening across the world. And looking at bringing in new technology categories, bringing in, from AI through to storage, sustainability, big data, the fintech world, IoT, containers, a whole proliferary. And I invite you to have a look if you're in the startup world. The call to action really is for people to have a look if you're in the startup world, and see if it's something for you, see if it could be of benefit of you, and put your hat in the ring. You can go to the Tech Trailblazers website, and we're running the competition until early September, so there's still plenty of time to get involved. So let us know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. I'm glad that I'm glad I could introduce you to some new folks, because you've introduced me to some new folks as well in the past. So Tim, Justin, where can we connect with you and continue this conversation?
Yeah, and thanks again for having me. It's always great to engage in these kinds of thought-provoking conversations, and hopefully folks listening get some nuggets out of it too. It'll be great to see the Tech Trailblazers and see how that progresses as well. You can find me on social media. I do participate in Twitter and Threads, but probably mostly on LinkedIn, and then have my own blog at avoa.com, avoa.com. But would love to hear from you and hear your perspective on some of the thoughts that I share in each of those spaces.
Yeah, likewise. This is always fun talking about this stuff. I love to do this all day long. If you're a customer and you want to understand this market some more, please get in touch with us. You can find our website at pivot9.com. You can find us on LinkedIn as well. And similarly, if you're a startup who wants to talk to customers and understand this better, we do a lot of work with people in that Series A, early stage kind of companies. We love working with you, so do get in touch. And if you want to hear more thoughts from me, I have a weekly newsletter which you can find on the website. It's called The Crux. So sign up, and you can get these kinds of thoughts into your inbox every week.
Thanks so much. And as for me, you'll find me at Gestalt IT. We do a couple of weekly podcasts. Mondays, utilizing tech. Right now, we're focusing on Edge. Tuesday is the on-premise podcast, which you're listening to right now. And then Wednesday is our weekly news rundown program. We also have a newsletter. It'd be great for you to sign up for that. Also, maybe check out the Tech Field Day website to learn more about what we're doing over there. Thanks for listening to the On-Premise IT podcast. If you enjoyed this discussion, please do give us a rating or a subscription in your favorite podcast application. And of course, please reach out. We would love to hear from you. You'll also find the show on YouTube, on the Gestalt IT YouTube channel. This podcast is brought to you by GestaltIT.com, your home for IT coverage from across the enterprise. For show notes and more episodes, go to GestaltIT.com/podcast. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.